Oxford, home of the greatest book in the English language, full of mysteries, comic plots, intrigue, and astounding facts. The Oxford English Dictionary tells us what words mean and where they came from. Together, we've launched a new word hunt. We've asked you to send us written evidence of the earliest recorded date for some of our most colourful words and phrases. But will what you send us stand up to the scrutiny of the mighty gatekeepers of the dictionary? Would it help if I pleaded more? With your help, scores of entries in the OED have already been rewritten. But the challenge is not over yet. This week, the dictionary has invited us to search out the origins of the expressions we use when we don't want to say what we mean. Euphemisms. A euphemism is rather like a conjuring trick which magics an offensive concept into something more acceptable. But will we be able to conjure up some origins for the dictionary? Comedian Arthur Smith asks when and why we began to say going to the loo.
I'm going to the loo. I'm having a pee over the side of the boat.
Michael Portillo gets fired up about the euphemisms we use when we go to war.
I was Secretary for Defence, a nice soft phrase.
I join word hunters to find out if a domestic, meaning violence in the home, existed before Z-cars. And when did glamour, as in glamour model, become code for soft porn? The original ancient Greek euphemismos meant using auspicious words of good omen. Our fears are slightly different. Modern euphemism is not about placating the gods so much as placating the neighbours. We use it for the things we feel awkward about: sex, death, and, of course, the lavatory and its functions. The English language has many euphemisms for going to the toilet, including going to the toilet. The word toilet is a diminutive of the French toile, meaning a cloth, of the sort used for protecting one's clothes while powdering one's wig, a staple of any bathroom cabinet. But what about loo? Where does that come from? Arthur Smith joins the word hunters to find out.
I remember when I was 12 and my American auntie announced she was going to the restroom, and I thought that she had suddenly and inexplicably needed a lie down. And as for going to the bathroom, nobody needs that many baths.
In Britain, you won't take a comfort break, but you might use a public convenience, obey a call of nature, or in some circles, wring out your socks. Unless you actually say, I need a crap, your toilet talk will be polite. But what of loo? The dictionary is unsure about it, so they've asked for our help. The earliest recorded evidence for the word loo suggests it's rather posh. It's in a 1940 novel by the famous aristocrat Nancy Mitford. But you word hunters have come up with some intriguing ideas, which date the origins of loo much further back. Most popular was garde-lou, a misspelling of the French garde l'eau, mind the water. In their best French, the housemaids of grand Edinburgh houses shouted garde-lou as they tipped the contents of chamber pots onto the streets below.
A personal note here. Once, when I was roistering up the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, a person chose to revive the tradition of garde-lou, and I got a very dirty and wet jacket indeed. But I'm wise to that now. It's a pleasing theory for the origin of the word loo, but does seem to be referring to a different activity.
The maritime lexicologists among you offer a different idea. One of them is Ozzie Stewart, who won a bronze medal for sailing at the Barcelona Olympics, so he should know what he's talking about.
Well, in my opinion, and most sailors' opinion, the loo comes from the expression the leeward side, And on a boat, especially on the old sailing boats, the leeward side is the opposite side from the windward side.
That's the leeward, away
That's right,
from the wind.
away from the wind. So
Yes.
it would always be better to go to the loo on the leeward side.
Yes, it would be unfortunate the other way, I could imagine. Yes.
And since the old sailing ships, I think the leeward side has always been the loo area as such.
I'm going
as
to the
far as we're
loo.
concerned.
I'm having a pee over the side of the boat.
Good in theory, but Ozzy has no written evidence, and we are left, therefore, still pissing into the wind.
Chains of word hunters have been occupied toiling away trying to flush out the truth behind the word loo, and that is my entry in most toilet puns in a sentence competition. One theory states that it was being used in aristocratic circles at the turn of the last century and only came into general usage after the Second World War. And, apparently, there may be a royal connection.
I've come to Shugborough Hall in Staffordshire, ancestral seat of the late Patrick Anson, Lord Lichfield, society photographer and the Queen's first cousin. The Ansons went to the loo long before the Mitfords, according to one word hunter who works here, Corinne Caddy.
This is Lady Louisa, and it's down to her that we have the word loo nowadays. She was the eldest daughter of the first Earl at Shugborough, and was supposed to have been somewhat of an unsavoury character. She was said to gossip about everybody and everyone, and not in the politest terms.
Nobody liked her.
Basically, yes. During a hunting weekend, her nephews, as quite a cruel practical joke, took the bedroom plate from her door, which said Lady Louisa on it, and put it on the toilet door. After that, the toilet became known as the Lady Loo.
I'm just going to the Lady Loo. It sounds like a far-fetched claim. Have you got any evidence for this?
I do. I have a letter here from the 70s written by Stephen Runciman. And he says, now in these democratic days, the courtesy title has been dropped. And within the last 30 years or so, only really since the war, the term has seeped down into the middle class and even into working class usage.
Disgusting.
So, the Honourable Sir Stephen Runciman, eminent historian and a friend of the Ansons, tells the story of the unfortunate Lady Louisa in this letter, albeit over 100 years later, proving conclusively that going to the loo dates back to a posh boys prank of 1867. Lady Lou, we're all laughing at you, girl.
Arthur's handed in his evidence. Here is the Honourable Sir Stephen Runciman's letter, which could be the ultimate proof that poor Lady Louise Anson was the original Lou. At the end of the programme, I'll be presenting it to the gatekeepers of the dictionary to see if we can persuade them to include it. Next, glamour. The word glamour originally meant magic or enchantment. It shares its root with the word grammar, which originally meant all learning. But what the dictionary wants to know is when this erudite word became linked to a euphemism for soft porn. Help us with this entry, pleaded the OED. We've only been able to get glamour, as in topless model, back to 1981. So was it invented in 1981? Perhaps by page 3 girls who needed something to put on their business cards. Word hunter and amateur photographer Sidney Payne claims he knows the answer. He's been taking girly photos since the 1940s.
Young lady under 21 required as photographer's model, occasional evenings only, special work. I used to place my ads in the Harrow Observer, and the address to which I asked them to reply was Glamour Photo, which was spelt Glamafoto. Glamour photographs in those days meant anything from straight portraits right down to nudes, but they were presented in a tasteful but seductive manner.
Sorry, Sydney. Your glamour girls don't strictly qualify for an X rating, which suggests that in the Harrow of the 40s, the term glamour model hadn't yet acquired its euphemistic sense. But our next word hunter, Soho photographer and film director Stanley Long, leads us deep into X-rated territory. The Soho of the 50s.
Well, this is my old stamping ground of 50 years ago. This was my old studio. It's not the same building anymore.
Stanley claims that the euphemistic meaning of glamour models began with the birth of the porn industry, and he's got hard evidence to back this up.
The earliest evidence that I can find to do with glamour models is a catalogue that I published in 1960. It's called the Glamour Catalogue, which advertised the films that I made, which were all the glamour models. The term glamour models was commonly used. It says here, number 137, 3 glamour girls take a quiet motor launch trip and head for a quiet stretch of water. You must remember we're going back to a time when naked women on the screen was something of an unusual occurrence. The public went mad for seeing anything approaching a little bit risque.
Then more word hunt gold. Pamela Green, who was herself a pioneering star of the Soho glamour scene, got in touch. She has evidence going even further back in the form of a 1958 glamour catalogue.
This is the earliest evidence I have of the glamour guide in 1958 using the word glamour.
In the 50s, Pamela was Britain's most famous topless model.
I was an art student going on to the Royal Academy, but the grant was so small that it was about, I think, £100 a year. Somebody said, they are looking for nudes. And I thought, well, I'll try for it. And I did.
That's a great result. With Stanley and Pamela's evidence, we've been able to trace glamour in the right sense of glamour model back 23 years. One of the OED online entries which gets the most hits is regime change.
It should involve regime change. Regime change is in the interest of the world.
It used to mean simply a change of government. But now it's become a loaded euphemism for the violent overthrow of a hostile administration. The OED's earliest reference to this euphemism is 1990, the time of the Nicaraguan conflict. They asked us if we could trace the origins back any further. And once again, word hunters have come up trumps, with this article revealing an American plot to topple Gaddafi and create regime change in Libya. It's 1987, giving us a 3-year anti-dating. But generally, military euphemisms go back a lot further than that. Ex-Minister of Defence Michael Portillo steps up to the dispatch box to argue that these veiled terms play a vital role in times of war.
In an age of spin doctors, you could be forgiven for thinking that military euphemisms date from the age of Blair and Bush. Not so. A decade ago, when I was Secretary of State for Defence and we were bombing Serbian pylons and bridges, chilling phrases like target-rich environment were already common. But fighting men have been using euphemisms for a very long time. For centuries, in fact.
Ancient Rome's legions came, saw, and conquered much of the world. One favoured Latin word for that was componere, meaning not to vanquish, but merely to pacify. And Anglo-Saxons wrote poetically of heroes having fallen when they'd actually died in battle. But it was in the 2 world wars of the 20th century that military euphemisms became a macabre art form. Phrases such as friendly fire, which roughly translates as getting shot at by your own side, originated in the trenches of the First World War. And combat fatigue, a veiled term for mental trauma, surfaced in the intensity of mechanised battle during World War II. When I ran the MOD, we were awash with euphemisms, and we were rightly satirised, not least by those like John O'Farrell, writing for Spitting Image.
Governments have absorbed some of these euphemisms from the military. Why do you think they've done that?
Well, I think firstly, they like to give the impression they're in the know and completely up to speed with all the sort of military jargon that gives the impression that they have the faintest idea what's going on, which no one does in war anyway. But also,
I plead guilty.
Well, actually, you wouldn't have been Minister of Defence 30 years earlier. You were Minister of War, technically, but that was a change that was made.
I was Secretary of Defence, which is a much softer term.
A much more acceptable phrase to the British public.
Who do you think are the worst offenders when it comes to devising these jargons and euphemisms?
No contest at all. I think it's the Pentagon. In the age of television, war is much more graphic and much more frightening. And so words are needed to soften the grim reality. Collateral damage is a word that is bandied around by the Pentagon and by the MOD. And that is dead people who weren't supposed to get shot at, basically. You can't say, well, we fired our missiles and we killed a load of kids in a nursery school. So they're going to say there was some collateral damage. And lately I've heard the word transfer tube, and that is finally a word which sort of hides what it really is. It sounds more like somebody changing on the Northern Line to the Hammersmith and City, when actually you're talking about dead bodies coming home from a war zone.
Transfer tubes. War today is something we view on television. Maybe we're losing our ability to distinguish between the real killing and what we see in movies. And building on that, political leaders can exploit military euphemisms to mask the brutal reality of mutilation and violent death.
But military euphemisms were invented not by politicians, but by fighting men. They must have had a reason for dreaming them up. Do they perhaps help in sustaining morale by glossing over the gory details of life and death in battle? How is this soft soaping regarded by the hard men who go to war?
For Colonel Nick Borwell, who's fought in all the recent theatres, euphemisms enable the soldier to laugh where the verbal direct hit would not.
Armies particularly develop a sort of gallows humour about what's going on around them. One of my, I suppose, favourites, because it's so awful, is the expression sympathetic detonation, where a soldier or a vehicle with ammunition on it or on the person, if it's hit, actually the ammunition goes off as well. Not much sympathetic about that. The presence of death on a battlefield or in military operations is something that is around the soldiers, if not all the time, but they learn to expect it and they learn to deal with it.
Whereas today's euphemisms for death are sterile and technocratic, those of yesteryear relied on gritty wit, like pushing up the daisies, which was first used of the fallen, or should I say dead, of the Great War. Another of my favourites reflects the grim jocularity of the brave pilots of World War II. Going for a Burton. Popping down for a pint of Burton's ale.
We used to be in a cafe, you know, having a drink, and RAF blokes were sitting by the side. They used to say, oh, Smithy's gone for a Burton. Well, we knew then that he'd been shot down. He no need to have been a pilot, he could have been an observer or gunner, but he'd been shot down and he's dead. That's what that means.
All of us in our daily lives use euphemisms to soften the blow of dread disease, disability and death. So why shouldn't the soldier, however brave, use the same technique to avoid dire reality for as long as he can? The problem has arisen in recent times when politicians have hijacked the euphemism in order to muddle and obscure. When they take us to war, we have the right to insist that they call a spade a spade.
Now back to the word hunt, and I'm on the trail of a word that takes us into another area of conflict. Every euphemism is another stitch in the lace curtain of language we've created to drape over the subjects we find embarrassing or improper for polite conversation. like a violent quarrel between husband and wife, sometimes called a domestic. Sounds like a nice, cosy thing, but it isn't. Help us with this euphemism, said the OED. Where did it come from, and when was it born?
I'll give you what for. Come here. All right.
Beating your wife was not always a crime. In fact, you could do it with a stick, as long as it was no wider than your thumb. That gave us the phrase rule of thumb. Delightful. When wife battering was banned in 1853, the term domestic quarrel started to creep into police manuals. But when was it abbreviated?
Z Victor 2 for BD.
Go ahead, Z Victor 2.
What's the number of this plan for me?
352.
Victor 1.
Z Victor 1, go to the tower.
Today, the earliest evidence of domestic in the OED is from a TV guide to the language of Z-cars, published in 1963. Did the scriptwriters get it from the old bill, or did they invent it themselves? Time to investigate.
Come on, you big boys! What about la la la?
Kirby in Liverpool, the location for Z-cars, where Everton supporters still chant the familiar opening theme. I'm here to meet up with word hunter and ex-copper Stan Fletcher, who has some interesting leads. Was the word domestic used by the police on its own?
Yes, it was. When I joined in the early 60s, it was a common term. It would probably be a direction by radio. Please attend such and such an address, domestic.
When you were writing a report, would you use the word domestic then?
It would be recorded probably as a domestic dispute. Slightly more official, really, than just domestic. I think you might find it in officers' notebooks, if we could ever get hold of one. The problem is that when notebooks were completed, they had to be handed in.
So what you're saying, Detective, is that the police have lost the evidence?
I should imagine that's the case, yes.
Suspicious, isn't it? Where the police are protecting their sources, perhaps other word hunters can help us more openly. We appealed for more information. In the meantime, I sat down to watch every episode of Z-Cars, hoping to find the word domestic. Unfortunately, some of the crucial early episodes have been lost. So I've come to the British Film Institute to meet Z-Cars writer Troy Kennedy Martin to see if we can find any clues in his early scripts. Well, what I'm hoping to do is actually look through some of these old Z-Cars scripts and find a domestic disturbance, ideally with the word domestic. May bring back some memories for you.
Yes.
There's a sudden death.
So that's the only murder that was in the first 13.
Well, we're not going to find a domestic in here if that's a murder story.
No.
What one have you got there?
This is the first draft of Four of a Kind.
Oh, look, it's here. Look at this.
Right.
Could you send Z Victor 1 to Bridge Road, Newtown, name of Wiggins, domestic, and then it says trouble, but it's crossed out?
I think I've done that. Trouble's the wrong word, so just leave it as domestic.
And then look here, you just sent a crime card to that domestic.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a noun, domestic.
Yeah.
Let me check my list. Okay, so that's broadcast 2nd of January 1962. So it must have been written before then.
Well, it was written in 1961, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. This is
even
gold
earlier
dust. As long as I can smuggle this document out of the British Film Institute, we're laughing. Thank you very much. Feeling pretty smug about my Z-Cars script, I arrive back at headquarters only to discover that one word hunter has come up with a far more exciting find. This is incredible. Just when we thought we had all our evidence together to go to the dictionary, at the last minute, in came a genuine policeman's notebook from 1957. And he's listed the fact he's been called to a domestic in Buckley, and a policeman has sent this in at great personal risk, because he's not meant to have the notebook. Personally, this is one of the most amazing pieces of evidence I've ever seen in the word hunt. The time has come for us to visit the gatekeepers of the dictionary to find out if our evidence will survive their scrutiny, or whether it will kick the bucket, pop its clogs, snuff it. I'm pretty confident about our anti-dating for glamour model.
they're obviously topless, and they're in a supplement called Glamour Guide.
Regime change looks hopeful too. And will they accept our letter from the 70s telling the story of Lady Lou?
Police officer's 3-in-1 pocketbook. Good.
Wow. Are we really supposed to have this?
It's our most precious find.
Friday, 27th of December.
I can't wait for the verdict. How did we get on?
Well, after considering all the evidence for Glamour Model, we decided that was fine, and also regime change as well, so 2 were good.
Great. Now, Tanya, I need to have a conversation with you about Lou and its etymology. You're the queen of where words come from.
It is a lovely story. I'm afraid I have come across it before. The problem that we have with it as evidence is that it is anecdotal.
You've got this gap. This story tells about an incident that supposedly took place in 1867.
Yep.
Yep.
It's a long time, isn't it? It's a long time, no evidence.
Where's the evidence? And after all this time, nobody has found any evidence to plug the gap.
Maybe people do have evidence of Lady Lou for toilet, and it is lurking in their collections of letters, or even published letters that we haven't picked up around the time, and we'd love to have them.
I suppose that was always a bit of a long shot, but it's a lovely story. Less nice, the concept of a domestic. How is our evidence on that?
Well, we knew that it probably occurred in an early episode of Z-Cars because our first quotation was from a guide to the language of Z-Cars. One of the examples you showed us has exactly the right signposts that say not just the word occurs, but it's a noun.
So you'll accept that as an anti-dating?
If it's verifiably 1962, it's better than the guide to the language of Z-Cars 1963.
Well, it couldn't be more verifiable. We've spoken to Troy Kennedy Martin, the author, and he was there and says it is.
Fine.
Now, even better, though, 1957, the policeman's notebook.
Having a real policeman's notebook, it's fantastic. Well, how else would we get access to this kind of thing?
Unfortunately, although it's the right kind of evidence, the evidence for the word domestic is not conclusive in exactly the way that the Z-Cars evidence is conclusive. It's just the word domestic in a list, and if you're writing down single words, there's no guide as to whether they're nouns or adjectives.
But the reason it's in Z-Cars is because Troy Kennedy Martin listened to the police radio, he heard police slang, and they would say domestic meaning a fight.
Sure.
And there is a policeman writing it in his notebook. Must be the same sense.
Nah, that's the false logic. Just because policemen use the noun doesn't mean to say they don't also use the adjective.
John, that notebook has been sent to us by a real policeman at some risk to himself. He hasn't even told us his name. He's so worried about sending it in. He's only done it because he's so committed to anti-dating the word. We can't not believe him.
Well, we're very grateful to him for sending it in, and I'm sure, at least I'm prepared to believe that the word domestic was used as a noun at that time, but that just isn't an example of it, and so we'll have to reject it.
We've got the word of a policeman.
You're quite right, but we're still not going to accept it.
Would you go to a policeman for grammar?
I refuse to answer any further questions. Well, we got the Z-Car script in and several other changes. If you have extra information about Lady Lou, send it to us at our website. We might make more changes still. Still can't believe they doubt the police, though. But don't be put off. Go to the website bbc.co.uk/Balderdash and you too can join the word hunt. You can also access the OED online and read all our brand new entries.
And there's more next week, same time, 10 o'clock here on BBC Two. And over on BBC One now, the Prince of Darkness himself, Ozzy Osbourne, joins Jonathan Ross for Friday night.